All right, so you probably knew I had to be talking about these. These are Tamron's newest f2.8 prime lenses, the 35 and the 24, and you probably knew that because these f2.8 zooms from Tamron I have been using for a while. Huge fan of, talked about, got videos on both. I'll link to those in the description, but basically these gave us everything we wanted in an awesome zoom lens. So f2.8 aperture, which previously, if you wanted that, you were looking at these massive lenses. So these are really compact, gave us amazing quality from those. They didn't cost as much as a camera, which was a nice addition to that. And so when Tamron announced that they were going to be getting into these prime lenses for Sony, I was pretty ecstatic because, yeah, these were going to be awesome. But when they announced that these were going to be f2.8 35, 24, and they got a 20mm coming in, I didn't quite know what to think. I mean, do we really need a f2.8 prime when we've got these available? And also Sony's got this little gem, the 28mm f2, which kind of gives us a one-stop advantage on the aperture. So I really wanted to check these out and see if Tamron lenses could deliver. So let's take these for a spin and see what these have to offer. So I've seen a couple people compare like the 35mm 2.8 to Sony's or the Zeiss 35mm f2.8. For me, that's not the comparison I wanted because to me, it's not about finding the best 35mm f2.8. It's about finding the best prime lens that gives us some advantages. It's pretty compact, that doesn't involve skipping next month's mortgage. And for me, that's more about finding out how it performs with like this 28mm f2, which is right around that same price range, or the Tamron zoom lenses, which are, again, are going to be more expensive, but at least you're going to cover a couple focal lengths in that. So that for me was kind of the test that I wanted. So that's what I did. Now, when it comes to the build quality here, it's very plasticky. It feels a lot like this. It's a high-grade plastic, but you are going to notice a difference between this and, say, like a metal design like this, or the metal design on Sony's 35mm 1.8 or their 24mm 1.8, which are kind of the upgrades from this. And if you want to go with a higher end f1.8 or the prime lens in general, those are probably the ones you should be looking for. So I don't really think that these are incredibly compact, because when you look at those lenses or this lens, they're actually a lot smaller in many areas, and then also they don't have kind of this growth for the larger diameter up front, which when you're using Sony cameras, it can get a little bit close to your fingers right here. So I do think that that's not really the reason that I would go with these lenses. So one of the reasons that these are probably a little bit longer is that these have macro capabilities, or at least a 1 and 2 macro capability, which is actually really massive, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Now, what happens is that actually this is an external focusing element, and it will physically move in and out and quite a bit when it goes from focusing at its max to focusing at its minimum. Now, these are pretty decently weather sealed. They have a rubber gasket around this. I do worry a little bit about these, as if any sand or dust or anything like that gets stuck inside of here and begins to kind of work its way into that mechanism, that always concerns me, while most other lenses like this are going to focus internally. So there's nothing really outside for any dust and debris to get inside. Now that does bring up one of the best features about this lens, which is that macro ability. And yes, it is really amazing to be able to do. You can really get some close-up shots on these. However, with the focal lengths being kind of on the wider end with 24 and 35, that meant your focusing object really needed to be about like 2-3 inches in front of the lens in order to get that maximum magnification, and that's a little close. So I don't think that these are really macro lenses, not the focal lengths you'd want to use. Typically, you'd want to be at like 60 to 100 millimeters for a macro lens, just so you can keep your subject a couple inches further away from that lens. However, to me, this was more of a prime lens that I could focus on any object, no matter how close it was, more than specifically using it for macro abilities. So that kind of brings up the focusing of these, and that's honestly where things kind of took a turn for the worst. And this was originally supposed to be just a brief hands-on video, and it kind of turned into a full review, because when I mounted these lenses on the camera, it just was really noisy. It kind of felt like old Tamron lenses from the past being used with adapters on lenses, and it didn't feel like I am used to with these, and the smoothness just wasn't there. So I was getting very choppy autofocus performance. Now they did still track my face and eye just fine. So from a focusing standpoint, they will absolutely lock right on your subject. However, they just don't quite have the speed of Sony's lenses or even Tamron's own zoom lenses, so they will struggle just a bit with faster moving subjects. Now, obviously the main event here is going to be quality, and these things are absolutely very sharp, even on the R4, which really pushes every limit you could possibly want with 61 megapixels. I mean, both of these lenses performed amazingly well. There's quite a bit of vignetting at f2.8, it gets better at f4, but even in the corners, things just looked really good for a $350 lens. And I don't think you could get much better optically. Now, the one exception to this is that the 24mm lens suffers some of the worst distortion I have ever seen. So it's obviously way worse than the 28mm Sony, but it's actually even worse than the Tamron 17-28 at its widest 17mm, which is just insane and really bad. Also, for some reason, the 24mm seems to be running a little wider than 24, so more like 21 to 22mm compared to my zoom lenses, so just keep that in mind. So I did compare this with the 28mm f2, and both Tamron's lenses were easily beating the Sony at 28mm, especially in the corners where it's a pretty much night and day difference. I also compared this to the 17-28 from Tamron, and things honestly look about equal here. So in one sense, you're getting the performance of a $900 lens for $350, which is great. On the other hand, it doesn't really justify going for these if you already own these. You're not going to see any better quality. You're going to be worse in terms of a lot of other issues and focusing issues. So if you can or already have one of Tamron's zoom lenses or both of Tamron's zoom lenses, you're probably going to be set with what you want as far as the capability and quality of these lenses. Now the bokeh on both of these lenses looks really great, especially in this price range. I mean, you can see just a little bit of a straight line because this is a 7-blade aperture instead of 9, which is in most higher end lenses. But compared to Sony's 28mm f2, the Tamron definitely looks cleaner. And usually on a wider angle f2.8, you're not going to see a lot of background blur on these. However, because you can get so much closer to your subject with the macro ability, that will help you blur out that background and kind of see that bokeh come to life. So I think the question I kept asking myself is who should actually pick up one of these f2.8 primes? And I think if you're a video shooter, probably not, because the focusing just wasn't smooth enough and it was loud. And I think there are better options around. Even Sony's 28mm f2 is going to give you that one-stop better aperture, quieter autofocus, and the difference in quality you're not going to notice very much in video mode. However, if you're a photo shooter, I think it's a vastly different approach. The 24mm just had way too much distortion for me. Combining that with the f2.8, just lacked a lot compared to the competition. I think there are better choices. In fact, even your kit zoom lens is probably going to be a good enough choice, but I probably would steer away from that. However, the 35mm I think is a different story because it does have great image quality all the way around. Yes, it's that same aperture, which I don't love at all, but compared to the other options, this is way less money than the competition. So combined with that great image quality, and the focusing was, again, not a big of an issue, and it's great to have that macro ability as well. So if you're in the market, and especially if you don't have the money for anything over like $400, then I do think that the 35mm f2.8 might be a great option to look at. Now, if you do have the extra cash, I do think that Sony's 35mm 1.8 and their 24mm 1.8 are well worth the upgrade. You're getting that wider aperture, much better build quality, much smoother focusing, and overall just much better lenses. And they're actually a smaller diameter, so better fit to the camera itself. Now, also take a look at Tamron 17-28 and 28-75. These are amazing lenses. They give you the zoom capability, which is really great, constant aperture, that same f2.8, and also with the great focusing. So that might be a great option for you. I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on this in the comments, because these were very perplexing options for Tamron to go right out of the gate with f2.8 primes. Confused me a little bit, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. But please hit like on this video. But before you go, definitely check out the reviews for these Tamron zoom lenses here. It's well worth it. And I'll see you guys soon in a new video.